Before I begin, if stories about fathers and daughters speak to you, if you're the kind of person who saves old notes in a shoe box and believes memories can still teach us, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next chapter. Now, the title you clicked on is the truth I ran from for years. I was ashamed Dad had no degree until at my job interview the recruiter said, "He taught me everything." My name is Emily Carter. I'm 27 years old, and I live in Austin, Texas, where glass offices throw their reflections on the river and newcomers talk about rounds of funding like they are reading the weather. If you stand on the corner of Congress and Second at 8 a.m., you can watch a river of people carrying laptops as if they are passports, managers in fitted shirts, designers in white sneakers, founders on scooters. Everyone seems to have a credential you can hang on a wall. And then there was my father, Robert Carter, whose most official document was a crumpled HVAC certification card, the edges rubbed smooth from years in his wallet. Are you sure you're seeing your father clearly? I wasn't. Shame is a small word for a big feeling. It fit in my mouth like a secret. I swallowed it at birthday parties, wore it like a collar at parent nights, hid it beneath the polite smile I practiced in mirrors. As a teenager, I became fluent in certain evasions. "Oh, my dad, he works with systems," I'd say, which was true if you stretched the word thin enough to cover air conditioners and old furnaces that coughed like they had lungs. If someone pressed me, "What systems?" I'd pretend my phone buzzed. Dad never pressed me for the truth. He had a way of letting silence be a kindness. He'd come home with his hands nicked and oil dark, holding the day like a heavy toolbox he never asked anyone to carry. He kept a rag in his back pocket that my mother called his handkerchief, though it never touched his face. After dinner, he'd sit at the kitchen table, open a spiral notebook, and write down addresses, model numbers, and reminders to call Mrs. Garcia about the unit on her roof. He wrote in block letters that were steady as fence posts. "School going okay?" he'd ask. "It's fine." "Fine's good. Fine keeps the lights on." He'd grin at his own joke and push the bowl of sliced peaches toward me. We were a make-do family. We made do with the car that whined on hills. We made do with window units because central air never found its way to our budget. We made do with Dad's hands, which could talk to broken machinery in a language I never learned. When a neighbor's /C died in July, Dad went over with his rag and a plastic bag of parts, and the neighbor would hug him like he'd delivered a weather miracle. "You saved us," they'd say. "Nonsense," he'd answer, swatting the air, embarrassed by gratitude. But in high school, make-do felt like a disease. Other girls had parents who executed mergers or taught at the university. Their fathers' names were followed by letters, MBA, PhD, like a procession of marching bands. Mine came home smelling faintly of Freon. I loved him. That's the hardest part to confess. I loved him, and I was ashamed of him, and the two feelings wrestled in me like siblings who didn't know they were related. The night shame sharpened into a blade. I was 16 and standing in a kitchen that had seen better paint jobs. I had made honor roll. Mom taped the certificate to the fridge crooked and proud. My friend Hannah was over, peeking into our cabinets. She found the mismatched glasses and mismatched plates and said nothing, but silence has a way of filling a room with opinion. Dad came in through the back door at 8, smelling like a long day, and caught us mid-search. "You girls want ice cream?" he asked, hopeful. "We're fine," I said quickly, too quickly, as if ice cream was a confession. And then Hannah asked, light as a skip, "Mr. Carter, where did you go to college?" He wiped his hands on that rag. "Life," he said cheerfully. "Majored in keeping things running." Hannah laughed. It wasn't cruel. It was the small surprised laugh of the college-bound, the kind that says, "Oh, I forgot some people live differently." But it burned in me anyway. After she left, my words tumbled out ugly. "Why do you always have to say it like that? Like a joke?" Like what? Dad asked, genuinely puzzled. Like you didn't have a choice. I wanted to bite the words back, but they were already flying. Like you never tried. He looked at me for a long second, not angry, not wounded, just measuring. I tried every day, Em. It just didn't look like what you're thinking. I went to my room and closed the door the way a child slams an era shut. In the darkness, the certificate on my dresser glowed like it had something to prove. There are photos from those years where my smile is a little too tight. Homecoming, with my corsage angled just so to hide the threadbare sleeve of my dress. Graduation, with Dad in the crowd wearing his one good shirt, clapping like applause could build a future by itself. I told people my mother couldn't attend because she was working a late shift. True. But I didn't say I'd asked Dad to skip the stage photo because my friends had parents who knew which fork to use at dinners I wasn't invited to. He didn't argue. He took my picture in the yard instead, making me turn toward the light. You always look best in mornings, son, he said, as if he'd been saving that line for the day I'd need to believe it. Shame eats very slowly. It nibbles. One day you wake up and entire rooms of your heart are missing. College was supposed to fix that. I got a scholarship, which surprised no one and me least of all. I studied marketing because it sounded like the language the world spoke, stories, but shiny. I learned how to build a brand out of a breath. I learned about funnels and engagement and the alchemy of getting people to care about things they didn't need. I walked past buildings named for donors and wondered what it meant to have your name welded to brick. I did not ask my father to visit campus. When he texted, "How's school?" I sent him photos of the library ceiling instead of the students beneath it. We measure people with bad rulers. A degree is a beautiful thing, I would never say otherwise, but a degree is not a soul. Try telling that to the version of me who graduated and believed my diploma was an affidavit of worth. I printed my resume on thick paper. I listed internships and projects and skills. I omitted what didn't fit. That I knew how to wrap a water pipe in winter because my dad had shown me how to keep a house safe from a night's bad temper. That I knew what a back-ordered part meant to a family who'd saved all month for the repair. That I knew how long a person could hold a door for a stranger. Exactly as long as it takes to prove something to yourself. After a year at a small agency with too many clients and too few weekends, I decided to reach higher. There was a job posting at a tech company downtown, glass windows, stocked fridges, an employee Slack channel for dogs. The listing was written like a dare. We're building things that matter. I filled out the application with a clenched jaw and tried to picture myself in all that glass. The night before my interview, Dad called. "How's your week, Em?" "Big one tomorrow," I said. He waited, the way he always did, giving me room. "An interview," he guessed. "Yeah. Proud of you," he said. The words were steady, landed well. "You need anything?" "No, Dad, I'm good." "You want me to swing by in the truck after, take you for Tex-Mex? Your mom says the new place on Riverside." "No, it's fine. If it goes well, I'll probably, I don't know, celebrate with friends." "Fine's good," he said, repeating his little line as if it was a protective charm. "You'll do great, Em." "I hope so." He cleared his throat. "Remember," he stopped himself, chuckled, "you don't need your old man's advice, you've got the paper for it." Something in the way he said paper made me stare at the wall. "What were you going to say?" "Just that when folks ask questions, they don't always want the smartest answer. Sometimes they want the truest one, that's all." "Okay, Dad. I'll have my phone on if you need me." He hung up and the apartment went back to its quiet. I looked around at the little life I'd stacked. The thrifted bookshelf pretending to be new. The tiny basil plant I kept forgetting to water. The degree in its frame leaning against the baseboard because I hadn't decided where to hang it. I sat on the rug and folded my blazer and placed it on the chair like it was a person I didn't know how to take care of. Then I opened my laptop and searched for the company again, reading their mission statements as if mission statements could raise a child. Sleep, when it came, was thin. I dreamed of thermostats turning themselves down to 0. Morning found the city already caffeinated. I walked in with the river of people and told myself I belonged. The building's lobby was a study in confidence. Polished concrete, living walls, framed patents, receptionist with a headset like a crown. I checked in. My name showed on an iPad screen, my last name sitting there simply, Carter, as if it carried nothing old at all. Sparkling or still? The receptionist asked, and I thought, people here choose their water like they choose their words. Still, I said. I sat with my bottle and rehearsed the answers I'd practiced into the mirror until they sounded like a person who had never been indecisive. Tell us about a time you led a team. What's your greatest strength? What would you do if your campaign underperformed? Every answer had 3 parts and a small twist at the end, like a good TV episode. I'd timed myself. I'd ironed empathy into my sentences. I'd put my hair up because everyone tells you hair up says I mean business. And today I did. The recruiter was 10 minutes late, and 10 minutes is a strange amount of time. Too short to start anything, too long to pretend you're not waiting. I watched other candidates glide in their suits. I recognized the look. People who believe rooms are better for having them in it. I went to the restroom and looked at my reflection. There she was, Emily Carter, B.S., with a blazer and a steady breath and a father who once fixed an Ruiz family's unit in the middle of a thunderstorm because their baby was sick and heat makes sick worse. I did not include that in my resume. When the recruiter arrived, he had the easy stride of someone who had practiced ease. Early 30s, maybe. No tie. The company badge dangled like a casual credential. Emily, he said, offering his hand. His palm was soft, but his grip was firm, the way seminars teach you. I'm Daniel. Nice to meet you, I said, standing, trying to match his steadiness. The conference room door sighed open and closed behind us. It was an earnest room, a rectangle table, 6 chairs, a screen sharing some slide about growth trajectories. Daniel sat, I sat. He glanced at my resume. He did the small nod people do when the font choice passes muster. So, he began, why here? I opened my mouth, but he paused. His eyes had dropped ever so slightly to my last name. A barely there moment, the way a memory brushes a person's face before it lets go. Carter, he said, and his voice changed in that subtle key change of recognition. Emily, do you happen to be related to Robert Carter? The room felt suddenly smaller. All I saw was a rag in a back pocket and a crooked certificate on a fridge and a laugh that wasn't a joke. My father's name, floating in this glass building, sounded like a note from a different song. Yes, I said, careful. He's my dad. Daniel sat back as if something inside him had stood up. That is the only way I can describe it. Huh, he said softly, and he smiled, not the kind you give to be polite, but the kind that remembers. Okay. Okay? What did okay mean? My mouth was dry. I wanted to reach for the water on the table, but afraid my hand would shake in a way that told on me. We'll get to you in a second, he said, almost apologetic, as if he'd opened the wrong file. It's just that name. His eyes flicked to the door to the hallway beyond, like a person measuring whether to tell a story. Then he looked back at me. Never mind. Tell me about a time you led a team. I exhaled a practiced answer, but the world had already shifted a fraction of an inch. There are moments when your past arrives, asking to be let in, and your heart, surprised by its own hospitality, reaches for the lock. You can spend years looking away from a person and still be recognized by the light you refuse to see. I didn't know it yet, but a bridge had been built across a canyon I'd pretended wasn't there. I told Daniel about leading a student group through a messy campaign pivot. I talked about metrics and lessons learned and how we turned a poor first week into a strong quarter. He nodded. He asked follow-ups. I kept my answers clipped, structured, safe. But beneath the table, my hands remembered the weight of a toolbox. In the far corner of the room, something like a ghost of Freon hummed. When the opening questions were done, Daniel set his pen down. He folded his hands the way people do when they are about to say something that matters. "Emily," he said, "I'm going to step off the script for a second." "Of course." "This is going to sound odd," he said, half laughing at himself, "but I grew up off South First, behind the old service station that used to be there. If your dad is who I think he is, well, he once—" He stopped, shook his head lightly, as if he could brush a memory back into place. "We'll get there." He smiled again, and in that smile was a boy I hadn't met yet, and a story I didn't know was mine. Outside the glass, people moved with their water bottles and their phones and their plans. Inside the glass, my father's name had just pulled a chair up to the table, and for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't sure if I was ashamed, or if I was simply afraid of being wrong about the man who taught me how to stand in a room and not pretend to be someone else. I straightened a page in my folder. "I'm listening," I said. He nodded, and the interview, my life, shifted from a series of polished answers to a story that began years before I learned how to pronounce brand positioning. What did Daniel know? What had Dad done that made a recruiter's voice soften? You think you own your story because you've told it to yourself so often, but turn a page, and you find your father there, writing in a spiral notebook with a steady hand, leaving you a line to follow. That's where I will leave you for now. In a conference room with a view of a city that confuses success with height, sitting across from a man who knows a part of my father I never bothered to learn. If you've ever carried the weight of a small shame for so long it started to feel like a personality trait, I hope you'll stay with me. There are names you only learn how to honor when someone else says them out loud. I used to think my father's story began with my shame. That's how narrow a child's vision can be, believing the world only starts when you step into it. The truth is, my father had already lived entire lives before I was old enough to spell my own name. To understand why the word degree never hung in our house, you'd have to walk back with me into the soil he grew from. Robert Carter was born in 1962 in a one-stoplight town in East Texas, the kind of place where people described directions with landmarks that no longer existed. "Turn left where the old mill used to be," his mother would say, and somehow everyone knew what she meant. His father, my grandfather, worked in a machine shop that smelled of grease and patience. His mother raised 6 children on casseroles that stretched further than they should have. They weren't poor enough to be pitied, but not rich enough to be envied either. They lived in that middle space where you're expected to keep your head down and be grateful for the little you have. Dad was the 3rd child and the one who could never sit still. He loved taking things apart. Radios, bicycles, the toaster. He dismantled them not out of cruelty but curiosity. "If it's broken, I can learn how it works," he told his siblings. Sometimes he could put the pieces back, sometimes he couldn't, and his mother would shake her head, reminding him not to waste what couldn't be replaced. But she smiled when she said it. She knew some kids broke rules the way other kids broke toys, just to understand the design. In school, my father wasn't the star student. He wasn't dumb, far from it, but the classroom walls were too narrow for his kind of intelligence. He could fix a lawn mower before he could drive one. He could rewire a lamp before he'd read half the novels assigned in English. Teachers wrote "easily distracted" in the margins of his report cards. The truth was, he wasn't distracted. He was simply tuned to a different frequency, one that hummed through machines and motors and hands-on work. But schools in the 1970s had little patience for frequencies they couldn't hear. By the time Dad turned 17, college was a dream spoken in hushed tones, the way a farmer might mention wanting a yacht. He had grades good enough to get into a state school if he stretched, if the money was there. But then, the summer before his senior year, his father, my grandfather, died suddenly of a heart attack while working his shift at the shop. The Carters went from middle space to barely hanging on overnight. Funeral expenses stacked on the kitchen table like unpaid bills, and the oldest brother had just shipped off to the army. My grandmother looked at her children, her eyes ringed with exhaustion, and asked the kind of question no mother should have to ask. "Which one of you is going to help keep this family afloat?" Robert raised his hand, not because he wanted to, because that's who he was. He took a job sweeping floors at the very shop his father died in. Later, he learned to run the machines. He stayed late, not for overtime pay, though that mattered, but because he couldn't walk past a broken piece of equipment without wanting to understand it. In the evenings, while his classmates filled out college applications, my father was covered in metal dust and sweat, earning just enough to keep his siblings in shoes that fit. Next year, he promised himself, "I'll go next year," but years have a way of piling up until you don't notice the stack has become a wall, and so the degree never came. When I was little, I didn't know any of this. Dad didn't tell stories like some fathers did. He never sat me down with a lecture that began, "When I was your age." He carried his past quietly, as if speaking it might cheapen the weight he'd once borne. What I knew of him was limited to the present. A man with calloused hands, a white work van that rattled when it idled, and a laugh that filled a room louder than any title. Kids don't care about backstory. They care about who drops them off at school, who makes sure the heat works in winter, who shows up to the recital even if he's wearing his uniform with his name stitched in red. But teenagers care about appearances. They measure their worth by comparison. When I turned 15, I began to notice who my friends' parents were. Lawyers, accountants, professors. People whose lives could be introduced in polite company without explanation. At banquets, mothers wore pearl necklaces that caught the light, and fathers ordered wine without glancing at the price. My dad, in his one brown jacket, looked like he'd wandered into the wrong story. I didn't know then that shame often has less to do with truth than with mirrors. The mirror I held up to my father was cracked, and every reflection made him smaller than he was. Shame makes you rewrite history. When you're young, you take the facts of your family and rearrange them into a story you think will impress the world. I used to tell people my dad ran a business, which technically wasn't a lie. He was self-employed. He fixed heating and cooling units in houses all over Austin, but I left out the part where his office was the front seat of his van, and his filing system was a milk crate of invoices. I never said he worked until his knuckles bled. I never said customers called at all hours because his number was the only one they trusted to answer. Those truths didn't fit the image I wanted. Looking back, I realize my shame wasn't really about him. It was about me. I was terrified of being judged by association. If people thought my father was less, then by extension I must be less. It's a cruel equation we learn too early. Your parents' status equals your value. I clung to that math because everyone around me seemed to believe it. Only later did I learn that equations built on pride collapse under their own weight. One evening when I was 16, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. They didn't know I was listening. My mom was worried about bills, and Dad was assuring her he'd picked up extra jobs. "I can squeeze in a service call before church," he said. "They've got a newborn at that house, can't leave them swearing all night." Mom sighed, "But you never rest." Dad's voice was quiet but certain. "I'll rest when Em gets through college. I just want her to have the shot I didn't." Those words should have softened me. They should have made me run into the kitchen and hug him. But shame distorts even kindness. I rolled my eyes in the dark and thought, there he goes again, making it about what he doesn't have. My father's sacrifice, refracted through my teenage arrogance, looked like weakness. That is the curse of adolescence, mistaking devotion for deficiency. In school, the distance between us grew like a crack you don't notice until the wall is splitting. My friends drove shiny cars handed down from their parents. I drove an ancient Civic my dad had resurrected with his own hands. It coughed smoke when it climbed hills, and kids would laugh, pretending to choke behind me. At night, I cried into my pillow not because of the car itself, but because of what it said about me. I wanted to be sleek, untouchable, effortless. Instead, I was the girl with the dad who didn't even graduate. I remember one night in particular. I was preparing for the SAT, surrounded by prep books and flashcards. Dad knocked on my door holding a plate of grilled cheese. He'd made the edges extra crispy the way I liked. "You're working hard," he said. "Want me to quiz you?" I snapped sharper than I meant to. "You wouldn't even know the answers." The silence after was heavy. He placed the plate on my desk anyway. "Maybe not," he said softly, "but I know you'll figure them out." He closed the door, and guilt stung me, but not enough to apologize. That's the thing about shame. It builds walls so thick that love has to climb them like ivy, slowly, almost invisibly. You don't notice until years later that the whole structure is covered in green. The older I got, the more elaborate my evasions became. In college applications, when asked about my family background, I phrased it as first-generation college student. It sounded noble, like I was breaking a cycle. In truth, it was another way of saying, my dad doesn't measure up. Professors praised me for overcoming adversity, and I let them, even though the adversity was the same man paying my rent with 12-hour workdays. When friends visited home with me, I staged the house like a play. I asked Mom to make her best dishes. I hid the rag Dad kept in his back pocket. I begged him not to wear his work boots inside. "At least put on something nice," I'd whisper. He'd chuckle and oblige, though nice usually meant a button-down shirt with a grease stain that never quite washed out. My friends were polite. They complimented the food. They thanked my parents. But I saw their subtle glances, at the mismatched furniture, the paint peeling on the porch, the absence of the little cues that said educated. They didn't mean harm, but comparison is a silent thief. It stole the pride I should have felt. At night, lying in my childhood bed, I'd think of how Dad's world and mine were diverging. He understood furnaces and compressors. I understood GPA and extracurriculars. His knowledge was practical, unglamorous, invisible until something broke. Mine was theoretical, shiny, printed on transcripts. I thought mine was superior. That illusion carried me through high school like a raft built of vanity. But rafts leak. They always do. During my senior year, our guidance counselor organized a career day. Parents were invited to speak about their jobs. I begged Dad not to volunteer. "Please," I said, "just sit this one out." He raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because it's not the kind of job people want to hear about." He studied me, and for a moment I thought he'd be angry, but instead he just nodded slowly. "All right, Em, I won't embarrass you." The words cut deeper than any anger could have, yet I said nothing. I let him shrink himself to protect me. That memory still aches like a scar you forget until you bump it. Other parents came that day in suits, PowerPoints in hand. They spoke about managing teams, negotiating contracts, changing markets. My classmates nodded, impressed. I sat there wishing my chair would swallow me whole. Because even though Dad wasn't in the room, I could feel his absence like a shadow. And I knew, deep down, that if he had spoken, he would have told the truest story of all. About work that kept people safe in the dead of summer, about nights he climbed onto roofs under lightning, about dignity that doesn't need applause. But I had silenced that story before it could be told. Looking back now, I see the seeds of doubt being planted. Every time I flinched at his name, every time I edited him out of my narrative, I was watering those seeds. And they grew. They grew into vines that wrapped around my relationship with him, strangling it slowly. By the time I left for college, the distance between us was wide enough to be mistaken for indifference. But here's the thing about seeds. They don't just grow weeds. Sometimes, buried deep, they grow truths you can't see until they break the soil. My father's silence, his patience, his sacrifices, they were seeds too. And though I ignored them, they were germinating, waiting for the day I'd notice the green pushing through the cracks of my arrogance. At the time, though, I only saw the weeds. I saw a man without a degree, without prestige, without the kind of respect the world applauds, and I mistook that for failure. I mistook him for less. I didn't yet know that one day in a glass office downtown, someone would look at me and say, "He taught me everything." And in that moment, every seed of shame, of doubt, of misunderstanding would bloom into something else entirely. By the time I left for college, my father and I spoke a different language. His was practical, filled with verbs like fix, check, tighten. Mine was theoretical, peppered with words like potential, strategy, networking. We both used English, but the meanings slipped past each other like two trains on parallel tracks. We waved in passing, but the distance between us grew every year. I came home less often than I should have. When I did, I arrived with my laptop under my arm, emails buzzing even during dinner. Dad would ask questions in his slow, deliberate way. "How are your classes? Are you eating enough?" And I'd answer with one eye on the screen. "Fine, yeah, busy." That was our rhythm, his patience, my distraction. Mom tried to bridge the gap. She'd slip details into conversation, hoping I'd notice. "Your dad's been busy. He fixed the Garcia's unit in the middle of that storm last week." Or, "Mr. Alvarez sent over a pecan pie because your dad stayed till midnight to help them." I'd nod, uninterested, as if those stories were footnotes instead of headlines. I was chasing success, and his stories didn't look like it. The arguments started small. They usually began with a question. One night during winter break, Dad asked, "What are you studying next semester?" "Digital branding," I said, proud of the course title. He frowned thoughtfully. "Branding, like ranch branding." I laughed sharp. "No, Dad, not cows. It's about how companies present themselves online." "Ah," he said slowly. "So, kind of like a reputation." "Not kind of exactly, but with data, with strategy." He nodded, trying to keep up. "Got it, so you're learning how to tell people you're good at what you do." "It's not just that," I insisted. "It's more complex." He smiled in that quiet way of his. "Everything's complex if you make it." The words stung. To me, they sounded like dismissal. To him, they were probably just an observation. But in that moment, I bristled. I wanted him to understand my world. I wanted him to be impressed. Instead, I felt belittled. And so I snapped. "Well, at least I'm not crawling on rooftops fixing broken fans." The silence that followed was unbearable. Mom shot me a look that could have cut glass. Dad simply leaned back in his chair. He didn't defend himself. He didn't retaliate. He just said, "Work is work, doesn't matter where you do it." But to me, it mattered. Too much. There was another fight worse than the first. It happened the summer after my sophomore year. I'd come home with a friend from college, Melissa, who came from a family of doctors. We were sitting in the living room when Dad walked in, sweaty and dusty from a long day. He greeted us warmly, shook Melissa's hand with his calloused grip. Then, proud as ever, he turned to her and said, "You should see the unit I fixed today. Thing was older than me, but I got it humming again." Melissa smiled politely, but I felt heat rush to my face. After she left, I exploded. "Why do you have to say things like that? Do you know how it makes me look?" Dad looked genuinely puzzled. "Like what?" "Like some mechanic's daughter, like I don't belong where I am." His expression changed, a flicker of hurt crossing his face. "Emily, that's who I am, that's what I do. Why should I pretend otherwise?" "Because people judge," I shot back. You don't understand. You've never been in a room where degrees and titles matter." His jaw tightened, the way it did when he was holding back. Then he said quietly, "Maybe I understand more than you think." We didn't speak the rest of the evening. The distance between us stretched wider, an invisible canyon carved by words we couldn't take back. If shame is a seed, anger is the water. I watered it daily. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became rarer. I told myself I was busy, but the truth was, I didn't want to feel the weight of his world pressing against mine. At school, I reinvented myself. I stopped mentioning my father altogether. If someone asked about my family, I redirected. "My mom works at a clinic," I'd say, leaving the sentence unfinished, hoping they wouldn't notice the absence of a father in the picture. But absence has a way of demanding attention. In ignoring him, I ignored a part of myself, and the farther I ran, the more lost I felt. One Christmas, when I was 21, we tried again. I came home with gifts wrapped in glossy paper, expensive things I thought would prove I was moving up. I gave Dad a new watch, sleek and modern. He unwrapped it slowly, smiled, and thanked me, but he never wore it. A week later, I found it sitting in the box on his dresser, untouched. Instead, he kept wearing his old watch, a scratched Timex he'd had for decades. "Why don't you wear the one I gave you?" I asked. He shrugged. "This one still works." I rolled my eyes. "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" he asked, not unkindly. I didn't have an answer, or maybe I didn't like the answer. The point was, I wanted him to look the part. I wanted him to fit into the world I was building, but he refused to trade practicality for pretense. That was his quiet rebellion, living honestly even if it embarrassed me. Looking back now, I realize the tragedy wasn't in his lack of a degree. It was in my lack of vision. He saw me clearly, saw my ambition, my hunger, my desire for more. I, meanwhile, looked at him through a fog of expectation. I measured him by standards he never signed up for, and in doing so, I missed the lessons he was teaching right in front of me. He never said, "I love you," in the ways movies script it, but he showed up, every single time. When my car broke down at midnight, he came. When I needed rent money because my part-time job fell short, he paid. When I cried over a boy who broke my heart, he sat on the porch steps beside me, silent, letting the night do the talking. These were degrees of love, earned through action, not awarded on paper. But I didn't see it then. I only saw the distance. And that distance defined our relationship for years, until one ordinary job interview cracked it open. There is a particular kind of silence that sits between a father and a daughter when both want to speak but neither knows how. It is heavier than anger, heavier than disappointment. It lingers in the corners of a house, in the pauses at dinner, in the way footsteps sound on separate floors. That was the silence that followed us for years. During my final year of college, I visited home less and less. When I did come, the silence was there waiting, as if it had been living in the walls. We'd exchange small talk, but beneath every word lay the weight of all the things we weren't saying. One evening, I arrived home to find Dad fixing the porch light. He was balanced on the old ladder, screwdriver in hand, his figure outlined against the fading sunset. I stood at the bottom, watching, thinking how out of place he looked against the painted sky, like a man whose world was limited to wires and screws. I didn't see the poetry in it then. I only saw what I wanted to escape. "You could hire someone for that," I said, half joking, half accusing. He glanced down, sweat on his forehead. "Why hire when you can do it yourself?" "Because it looks better," I muttered. "Because people notice." He tightened the bulb until it flickered alive. "People notice a light that works. They don't care who fixed it." It was a simple answer, but it felt like a lesson I wasn't ready to learn. I rolled my eyes and walked inside, missing the quiet wisdom in his words. The worst fight came that winter. I'd been offered an internship at a firm downtown, one that required long hours but promised prestige. I came home to tell my parents, expecting celebration. Mom hugged me tight, her pride spilling over. Dad smiled too, but his next words pierced me. "That's wonderful, Em, but make sure you're not just chasing a title. Make sure it matters." His tone was gentle, but I heard it as criticism. I snapped. "Not everyone gets to make sure it matters, Dad. Some of us actually have to prove ourselves. Some of us can't just fix air conditioners our whole lives." The room froze. Mom gasped softly. Dad's face fell, though he tried to hide it. His hands clenched, then released, like he was squeezing invisible pain. "If that's what you think of me," he said quietly, "then I've failed in more ways than one." I wanted to take the words back, but pride locked my lips. I turned away, retreating to my room, leaving him standing there with the weight of a lifetime dismissed in one cruel sentence. That night, I cried into my pillow, but I didn't apologize. Apologies felt like surrender, and at that stage of my life, I thought surrender was weakness. What I didn't understand was that humility is not weakness, it's strength dressed in softer clothes. After that, the distance became a canyon. We spoke only when necessary. I buried myself in work, in grades, in resumes. He buried himself in jobs, in customers, in keeping the house running. We orbited each other like planets, close enough to feel the pull, too far to touch. On the rare nights we sat together, the television filled the silence. He liked old westerns, stories of cowboys who fixed their own problems with grit and decency. I liked dramas set in cities, where clever dialogue solved conflicts. We sat side by side, eyes on different worlds, pretending the gap didn't exist. But every so often, his love slipped through the cracks. When my laptop broke, he stayed up late researching parts, even though he didn't understand software. When I caught the flu, he left soup outside my door without a word. These were his apologies, his offerings, his way of saying, "I'm here." And I accepted them silently, without acknowledgement. I thought accepting was enough. It wasn't. Looking back, I wonder if he ever spoke about me to others. Did he tell his friends at the hardware store, my daughters at the university? Did he swell with pride when he said it, or did he hesitate, knowing how I felt about his lack of a degree? I will never know. Fathers keep secrets like that. They protect you even from yourself. There is one memory, though, that haunts me. It was during my senior year of college. I came home late one night, exhausted, and found him sitting at the kitchen table, reading one of my textbooks. It was thick, filled with marketing theories and case studies. He squinted at the pages, mouthing the words slowly. "Dad, what are you doing?" I asked, half amused, half annoyed. He looked up, embarrassed. "Just trying to understand what you're learning. Thought maybe if I knew we'd have more to talk about." I laughed, not kindly. "You wouldn't get it." He closed the book gently, placed it back on the table. "Maybe not, but I want to try." I walked away, leaving him there under the dim kitchen light, his hands resting on a world he wanted to enter but couldn't. It wasn't until years later that I understood he wasn't trying to learn marketing, he was trying to learn me. The distance between us wasn't built in a day. It was built brick by brick, my pride, his silence, my words, his wounds. By the time I graduated, it felt permanent. At the ceremony, I spotted him in the crowd, wearing that same old jacket. He clapped and cheered, louder than anyone. I smiled for the cameras, but inside I felt the chasm. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself success would fill the gap. But success is a poor substitute for love. It shines bright, but it doesn't warm you. It took one job interview years later to teach me that the distance wasn't as permanent as I thought. That even across a canyon, a bridge could still be built. But in those years before, I didn't know. I only knew the silence, the fights, the shame. And that is how the distance between us defined my 20s. The morning of the interview began like any other, but in my memory it stands apart, gleaming like a shard of glass in a pile of stones. I woke early, ironed my blazer twice though it was already crisp, and rehearsed the answers I had memorized like lines in a play. I told myself I was prepared. What I didn't know was that no script could prepare me for the story, waiting on the other side of the conference room door. I took the elevator to the 12th floor of a glass tower in downtown Austin. The lobby smelled faintly of citrus and ambition. I sat in a chair that looked too modern to be comfortable, clutching my folder like it contained my future, which, in a way, it did. Around me, other candidates scrolled through notes on their phones, tapping and swiping as if answers could be conjured from glowing screens. I tried to mirror their calm, but inside, my chest thudded with a rhythm that betrayed me. When the recruiter finally arrived, he looked younger than I expected, early 30s maybe, with an easy smile and a handshake practiced enough to seem natural. His name was Daniel. He led me into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. I sat down, folded my hands neatly, and waited for the questions I had rehearsed. He glanced at my resume, nodding at the bullet points. Then his eyes landed on my last name. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Carter," he said slowly. "Are you by any chance related to Robert Carter?" My throat tightened. It felt like a trick question. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, he's my dad." Daniel leaned back in his chair, a smile tugging at his lips, but it wasn't the polite smile of a recruiter filling time. It was something else, nostalgic, almost reverent. "I thought so," he murmured. "Your dad, he used to fix the units in our old neighborhood. South First Street. I must have been, 10 years old. That man, he taught me more about work than any professor ever did." I blinked, unsure if I had heard right. My dad, the same man I'd spent years apologizing for, the man I had edited out of stories because his job embarrassed me. This recruiter, this gatekeeper to the future I wanted, was talking about him like a legend. "He taught you?" I repeated, my voice thin. Daniel nodded, eyes far away as if replaying an old film. "Yeah, my mom was raising us alone. The air conditioning broke in the middle of July. You know how brutal Texas summers can be. We didn't have the money to fix it. Your dad came over, stayed for hours, refused to take a dime. When I tried to thank him, he looked me in the eye and said, 'Work hard, kid, and take care of people when you can. That's all that matters.'" He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Funny thing is, I never forgot that. It's one of the reasons I went into HR. I wanted to build teams that valued integrity as much as skill." The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. In all my years of chasing titles and credentials, I had never considered that my father, without a degree, without prestige, had been someone's role model. Yet here it was, staring me in the face, reshaping everything I thought I knew. As the interview continued, Daniel asked me the usual questions, but I struggled to focus. My rehearsed answers felt hollow now, like reciting lines from the wrong play. My father's name lingered in the room, heavy and radiant, as though he were sitting there with us. Every time I opened my mouth, I could hear his voice. Sometimes they don't want the smartest answer. They want the truest one. When Daniel asked about leadership, I almost repeated the polished story I had prepared. But then I paused, inhaled, and said something else. "Leadership," I began slowly, "isn't just about strategies or outcomes. It's about showing up even when no one is watching. I learned that from my dad. He never managed a team or earned a promotion, but he built trust everywhere he went. People believed in him because he believed in them." Daniel's eyes lit up. "That's exactly right," he said. The words spilled out of me then, unplanned but undeniable. I told him about how my dad fixed neighbors' units without charging, how he worked through storms to keep families safe, how he kept promises even when they cost him. With each story, the shame I had carried for years loosened, like knots coming undone. For the first time, I spoke of my father not with embarrassment, but with pride. When the interview ended, Daniel shook my hand again. "You'll hear from us soon," he said warmly. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "You know, Emily, you should be proud. Your father's the kind of man this world needs more of. Don't ever forget that." I walked out of the building dazed, the city spinning around me. Outside, people hurried with coffee cups and briefcases, chasing their own measures of success. I stood on the sidewalk, clutching my folder, and felt tears sting my eyes. For years I had tried to distance myself from my dad, believing his lack of a degree was a stain on my identity. And yet, in this moment, his name had opened doors mine alone never could. The irony was almost cruel. The very thing I had been ashamed of was the very thing that made me remarkable in someone else's eyes. As I rode the bus home, I replayed Daniel's words. He taught me everything. I thought of the boy he once was, standing in a sweltering house, watching my dad work with steady hands and a steady heart. I thought of all the small lessons my dad had given me, lessons I had dismissed at the time. Patience, integrity, responsibility, love without advertisement. Those weren't chapters in any textbook, but they were the foundation of every success story worth telling. I stared out the window as the city blurred by, and for the first time I let myself wonder. Maybe my father's lack of a degree wasn't a failure. Maybe it was a different kind of education altogether, one written in sweat and sacrifice, in acts of kindness that ripple further than we know. That thought lodged itself in me like a seed, and I knew it would grow. I rode the bus home that afternoon with the recruiter's words echoing in my head. He taught me everything. The phrase wouldn't leave me alone. It clung to the edges of my thoughts like a burr you can't shake off. I stared at the people around me, an older woman carrying grocery bags, a teenager scrolling on his phone, a man in paint-splattered jeans, and wondered, how many of them had fathers like mine? Fathers who went unseen, unnamed, uncelebrated, but whose fingerprints were everywhere. By the time I stepped off the bus, dusk had settled over Austin. The city lights flickered on one by one, like stars coming down to meet the earth. I walked slowly, letting the rhythm of my steps match the rhythm of my thoughts. For the first time, I wasn't rushing anywhere. I was retracing. At home, the apartment was quiet. I kicked off my shoes and dropped my blazer on the couch. The framed degree leaned against the wall where it always did, waiting to be hung, like a promise I hadn't quite decided to keep. I looked at it differently now. Before, it had felt like my weapon, my shield against judgment. Tonight, it looked more like a mirror, and the reflection staring back wasn't as flawless as I wanted. I sat at the table and opened my notebook, the one I used for preparing interview answers. But instead of bullet points and strategies, I found myself writing down memories. Not polished stories, not accomplishments, just flashes of my father. The way he whistled while fixing a motor, as if music could coax it back to life. How he never left the house without his rag in his pocket, folded neatly in squares. The evenings he'd sit on the porch with sweet tea, boots unlaced, staring at the horizon like it was speaking to him. The time he drove across town at midnight because Mrs. Alvarez's heater broke and she had a newborn at home. As I wrote, I realized something startling. These were lessons. All along, he'd been teaching me, not through lectures or textbooks, but through the steady rhythm of his life. I remembered one winter evening when I was 12. Our own heater had gone out. I sat shivering under blankets while Dad knelt by the furnace, muttering to himself. Hours passed. Finally, warmth rushed through the vents, filling the house with relief. I had jumped up, cheering, "You fixed it, Dad." He'd smiled, exhausted, and said, "Of course, you take care of your own before anything else." At 12, it was just heat. Tonight, at 27, I realized it was philosophy. Later that evening, I called Mom. She picked up on the second ring. "How was the interview?" she asked. I hesitated. "Strange, good, I think, but strange." Strange how? They knew Dad, or at least they remembered him. One of the recruiters grew up in a neighborhood where Dad used to work. He said Dad taught him everything. There was a pause on the line, then Mom laughed softly, a laugh tinged with something like relief. "That doesn't surprise me." "Doesn't surprise you?" I asked, incredulous. "Why not?" "Because your father has been teaching people his whole life. He just never called it that. He doesn't wear the word teacher, but that's what he is. You just didn't see it before." Her words hit me like a tide. She was right. I hadn't seen it, not because it wasn't there, but because I hadn't been looking. The next day, I went to visit my parents. The drive felt longer than usual, though the roads were the same. When I pulled into the driveway, Dad was outside tinkering with the engine of his old truck. He looked up, wiping his hands on his rag, and smiled. "Didn't expect you today." I stood there, suddenly shy, as though I were meeting him for the first time. "I just wanted to stop by." He nodded, gesturing toward the truck. "This old thing's giving me trouble. Thought I'd see if I could coax a few more miles out of it." I walked closer, watching the way his hands moved, sure, steady, precise. Hands that had built our lives, one repair at a time. "Dad," I said, my voice catching, "do you remember the Alvarezes from South First Street?" He looked up, squinting. "Sure, nice family, had a baby girl back then. Why?" "One of the recruiters at my interview grew up there. He remembered you. He said you taught him everything." Dad blinked, surprised, then he chuckled, shaking his head. "Taught him everything? I doubt that." "No, he meant it," I insisted. "He said you showed him what hard work and integrity look like." He remembered. All these years later, Dad looked down at the engine, suddenly quiet. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he said softly, "Funny. You go through life thinking you're just doing your job. You don't realize people are watching." I swallowed hard, guilt pressing against my chest. For years, I had been watching too, but I had chosen to see the wrong things. That night over dinner, I saw my father differently. His laugh, his stories, even the way he pushed food around his plate, they all carried a weight I had never given them credit for. He wasn't just a man without a degree. He was a man with a curriculum of his own, one taught through action, through presence, through love disguised as labor. And I realized something else. Shame had been my teacher too, but in all the wrong ways. It had taught me to hide, to compare, to measure worth by standards that vanish when the lights go out. My father's lessons, on the other hand, were carved into the marrow of things. They would last. As I drove back to my apartment, the city lights looked different. They no longer seemed like trophies to chase. They looked like small reminders that someone somewhere had wired them, repaired them, kept them alive. People like my father, invisible, indispensable. I thought of Daniel again, of the way his eyes softened when he said Dad's name. And for the first time, instead of shame, I felt pride rising in me, quiet, steady, unshakable. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took down my framed degree from the floor where it had been leaning like an unclaimed promise, and I set it on the wall. But beside it, I hung something else, a photo of Dad standing in front of his van, grinning with grease on his cheek. Two different kinds of education, side by side, both valid, both worthy. When friends came over later, one of them pointed to the photo. "Who's that?" I smiled. "My father, the best teacher I ever had." And as I said it, I knew it was true. After that interview, the world looked the same but felt different. The streets of Austin still pulsed with traffic, the billboards still flashed their promises, the office towers still glittered in the sun. But underneath it all, something had shifted. It was as if a film had been peeled off my eyes, revealing colors I hadn't noticed before. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to look backward instead of forward. I stopped rushing to the next deadline, the next achievement, the next line on my résumé. Instead, I lingered in memory. And what I found surprised me. My father's lessons had been there all along, carved quietly into the background of my life like initials etched into wood. I had simply been too proud, too distracted to see them. The first lesson I remembered was patience. My father never hurried, not even when everything around him screamed urgency. Machines break at the worst times, air conditioners in July, heaters in January, refrigerators on Thanksgiving morning. People would call in a panic, voices sharp with desperation. Dad would nod, grab his toolbox, and head out the door. But once he arrived, he slowed everything down. I used to watch him sometimes, crouched in a stranger's living room, surrounded by wires and rattling parts. Sweat beaded on his forehead, grease smeared his knuckles, but his movements were steady, deliberate. He'd test one thing, then another, ruling out possibilities. "We'll get it," he'd say, even when it looked hopeless. "It just takes time." As a child, that patience frustrated me. I wanted quick fixes, instant results. I wanted magic. But he taught me, without ever saying the words, that patience isn't passive. It's active, intentional, strong. It's the quiet confidence that even the most complicated mess can be untangled if you give it enough steady attention. Years later, when I was leading group projects in college, I realized I'd inherited that same rhythm. While others panicked at the first setback, I found myself breathing slower, breaking problems into smaller pieces. I didn't credit Dad then. I told myself it was just good leadership. But now, sitting at my desk with the recruiter's words still echoing, I knew exactly where it came from. The second lesson was integrity. In our neighborhood, people trusted Dad in ways they didn't trust anyone else. He had no business card, no website, no Yelp reviews. His reputation traveled by word of mouth, carried on the gratitude of people he had helped. "Call Robert Carter," they'd say. "He won't cheat you." I remember one summer when a family down the street was scammed by a repairman. He charged them triple, then left their unit worse than before. Dad found out and shook his head, muttering under his breath. Then he spent 2 evenings after work fixing the mess, refusing payment. "Don't pay twice for the same job," he said. "Why not take their money?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Because integrity isn't for sale," he answered simply. At 16, I rolled my eyes at what I thought was a cliché. But that family never forgot. They baked us pies at Christmas, waved every time we drove past. Their loyalty was worth more than the money could ever be. Now, working in an industry obsessed with metrics and margins, I finally understood. Integrity doesn't show up on a balance sheet, but it compounds like interest, building a kind of wealth that lasts. The third lesson was dignity in labor. Growing up, I hated the sight of Dad's work clothes, stained shirts, scuffed boots, the rag always peeking from his pocket. They felt like symbols of limitation. But he wore them with a kind of quiet pride, as though they were a uniform that meant something sacred. One Saturday, I remember following him on a job. He let me tag along, probably hoping it would spark some interest in what he did. We pulled up to a small house where the unit had gone out in the middle of a heat wave. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, children sprawled on the floor with wet towels on their foreheads. Dad went straight to work. It took him nearly 3 hours, sweat dripping, hands black with grime. When the unit finally roared back to life, the kids cheered, their faces lighting up with relief. The parents hugged him, thanking him over and over. On the way home, I sat in silence, unsettled. "Doesn't it bother you?" I asked finally. "That people only call you when something's broken, that you're always fixing other people's problems?" He smiled, rolling down the window to let the hot air whip through the truck. "Not at all. That's what work is, showing up where you're needed. If people remember you because you fixed something that mattered, that's enough." At the time, I didn't understand. I wanted glamour, prestige, recognition. I didn't want to be remembered for fixing something. But now, years later, I thought of that family, their children breathing easier because of my father's sweat. Isn't that recognition, too? Isn't that prestige of the purest kind? The fourth lesson was keeping promises. Dad never made many promises, but when he did, he kept them, no matter how small. If he said he'd be home by dinner, he showed up, even if it meant skipping another job. If he told me we'd go for ice cream Saturday, we did. even if money was tight, even if he was tired. There was one rainy evening when I was 10. He had promised to take me to the library. The storm was so fierce that even Mom said we should stay home. But Dad grabbed an umbrella, held my hand, and we splashed through puddles all the way there. We came back soaked, books pressed under our jackets, laughing like it was an adventure. Why didn't we just wait? I asked later, drying off. Because waiting turns promises into maybes, he said. And maybes are for people you don't love enough. I'd forgotten that moment until the interview brought his voice back. Suddenly, it was clear. My father had built my trust in him, brick, by never letting his word slip. And that trust was the foundation of every confidence I carried into the world, even when I thought I was walking away from him. As these memories surfaced, I felt both gratitude and regret. Gratitude for the invisible education I'd received, regret that I had ignored it for so long. I had treated my father like a man without credentials, when in truth, his credentials were written all over the lives he touched. It struck me then that we measure the wrong things. Degrees, salaries, titles, they're visible, easy to count. But what about patience, integrity, dignity, trust? These can't be framed or hung on a wall, but they shape us more deeply than any diploma. And I realized, my father's lessons had already shaped me. Every success I had tasted, the scholarships, the internships, the jobs, I had built them on foundations he laid. Without his patience, I would have cracked under pressure. Without his integrity, I would have cut corners. Without his dignity, I would have chased hollow prestige. Without his promises, I would have doubted myself. He had taught me everything. I just hadn't been listening. Another lesson my father etched into me, though I only recognize it now, was resilience. Machines don't cooperate. Pipes burst after you fix them. Motors burn out right after you replace a part. I remember sitting in his van one summer evening after a job had gone sideways. He had spent 4 hours trying to repair a unit, only for it to break again 5 minutes after he packed up. I expected him to curse, to punch the dashboard, to give up. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, rubbed his face, and laughed. "Sometimes life's just stubborn," he said. "So you learn to be more stubborn." Then he drove back, unloaded his tools, and started again. He didn't charge the family extra. He didn't complain. He just did the work. By midnight, the unit hummed like new. That resilience seeped into me in ways I didn't realize. In college, when group projects fell apart, I was always the one to stay late, to keep pushing until we found a way forward. Professors called it leadership. But I knew now it was something deeper, something I had inhaled sitting in that van, watching my father choose persistence over despair. The next lesson was humility. Dad never advertised himself. He never put up signs or passed out flyers. He never bragged about the families he helped, the money he saved them, the nights he sacrificed. When people thanked him, he'd wave it off with a shrug. "Just doing my job," he'd say, even when he had gone far beyond what the job required. When I was younger, that humility embarrassed me. I thought it made him invisible. I wanted him to stand taller, to boast a little, to make people see him, but humility was his compass. It kept him grounded, honest, whole. I remember once, after he finished a repair for a wealthy family on the other side of town, they tried to give him an expensive bottle of wine as a tip. He smiled, thanked them, but declined. On the drive home, I asked why. "Because I didn't earn wine," he said. "I earned a day's wage, that's enough." At the time, I rolled my eyes, thinking he was foolish to turn down generosity. But now, I realize he was teaching me the value of boundaries, of knowing when to accept and when to walk away. That humility, quiet and stubborn, protected his dignity more fiercely than pride ever could. Then there was empathy. Dad saw people. He noticed what others overlooked. When he entered a home, he didn't just see a broken machine. He saw the family gathered in heat or cold, the stress in their eyes, the way they argued under pressure. He'd crack a joke to ease the tension. He'd take a few extra minutes to check in. "How's your mom doing? School going okay?" One afternoon, I tagged along to a service call at an elderly woman's house. Her husband had died recently, and she struggled to manage things on her own. The heater was broken, but that wasn't the only thing in disrepair. The house felt heavy with loneliness. Dad fixed the unit, but then he stayed for tea, listening as she talked about her husband, her garden, her memories. We sat there for an hour, the tea going cold, but I'll never forget the way she brightened as she spoke. On the drive home, I asked, "Why'd you stay so long?" "Because sometimes people need more than warm air," he answered. "Sometimes they just need someone to hear them." That moment stuck with me, though I buried it under years of teenage impatience. Now, as I stepped into a professional world where empathy is considered a soft skill, I understood. My father had been fluent in it long before the corporate world gave it a name. Each memory surfaced like a page in a book I hadn't realized I'd been writing. Patience, integrity, dignity, promises, resilience, humility, empathy. Together, they formed a curriculum of character, lessons taught not in lectures, but in the rhythm of a life lived faithfully. And I began to see myself differently. I had built my identity on being the opposite of my father, educated where he wasn't, ambitious where he was steady, polished where he was practical. But the truth was, everything I valued in myself had roots in him. My persistence, my ability to work with others, my trustworthiness, they weren't products of degrees or internships. They were gifts I'd inherited silently, absorbed without knowing, carried into rooms he never entered. That realization broke me open. For years, I had been ashamed of him. But really, I had been ashamed of seeing him in myself, because if he wasn't enough, then maybe I wasn't either. And so I tried to bury him to separate my life from his. Now I saw the truth. He had never been a weakness to hide. He had been my greatest strength all along. One night, not long after the interview, I sat with Dad on the porch. The air was cool, the cicadas humming in the trees. We didn't talk much. We never did. But as I sat there, I looked at his profile, the lines etched by years of sun, the roughness of his hands, the calm in his eyes, and I realized those were my lessons too. They were etched into me even if I had spent years pretending otherwise. I wanted to tell him then. I wanted to say, "Dad, I see you. I finally see you." But the words lodged in my throat. Instead, I sat in silence, letting the moment teach me again what he had always known. Sometimes the truest lessons are the ones left unspoken. It took me weeks to gather the courage. After the interview, after hearing my father's name spoken with reverence by a stranger, something inside me cracked open. Memories poured through, lessons I had ignored, truths I had dismissed. But knowing the truth and saying it aloud are different things. And when it came to my father, words had always been the hardest currency for me to spend. I called Mom first. She answered with her usual cheer, asking about work, about my apartment, about whether I was eating more than instant noodles. Finally, I blurted out, "I need to talk to Dad." There was a pause on the line, long enough for my heart to trip. Then she said softly, "He'll be glad to hear that, honey." I drove out on a Sunday afternoon. The sky was a clear, endless blue, the kind that makes the world feel both wide and intimate. The old Carter house came into view, porch paint peeling, the familiar truck parked crooked in the driveway. My stomach twisted with nerves. Dad was in the yard, bent over the mower. His back was to me, shirt damp with sweat. He straightened when he heard the car door slam. For a second, he just looked at me, shading his eyes with one hand. Then he smiled, small, cautious, like he didn't want to scare me off. He said simply. I swallowed. "Hey, Dad." We stood there for a beat too long, the air thick with everything we hadn't said. Finally, he gestured toward the porch. "Want some tea? Your mom just made a pitcher." I nodded, grateful for the excuse to sit, to ease into the moment. We sat across from each other, glasses sweating in the heat. The cicadas droned in the trees, filling the silence like background music. I stared at the condensation sliding down my glass, searching for words. I had this interview a few weeks ago, I began. Dad nodded, waiting. One of the recruiters, he knew you, from South First Street. He said you fixed their AC when he was a kid. He said you taught him everything. Dad chuckled softly, shaking his head. People exaggerate. No, Dad, he meant it. My voice cracked. It made me realize I've been wrong about so many things. His eyes lifted to mine, steady but unreadable. Wrong how? I took a deep breath. I spent years being ashamed of you, ashamed that you didn't have a degree, that you worked with your hands instead of wearing a suit. I thought it made me less somehow. I said things I shouldn't have. Cruel things. I acted like you weren't enough. And my throat closed. I'm sorry, Dad. The words hung in the air, fragile as glass. Dad leaned back, folding his arms. He didn't speak right away. I braced myself for anger, for disappointment. But when he did speak, his voice was calm. You were young. Young people get things twisted. They think worth comes in papers and paychecks. I did too once. That surprised me. You did. He nodded. When I was your age, I wanted a degree more than anything. Thought it was the only way to matter. But then life handed me a different road. I took it, and I tried to walk it well. Doesn't mean it didn't sting sometimes. I blinked, stunned. All these years, I'd thought he was immune to doubt, that he didn't care about what he lacked. But here he was, admitting it, the vulnerability I had never imagined. Why didn't you tell me? I whispered. He shrugged. Because I didn't want my regrets to become your excuses. I wanted you to run as far as you could without thinking you were carrying my failures. The words hit me like a weight. All this time, I had mistaken his silence for indifference. But it had been love disguised as restraint. We sat quietly for a while, the cicadas still buzzing, the air thick with summer. Then Dad spoke again. You hurt me, Em. His tone was gentle, not accusing. When you said you wished I had a degree, when you acted ashamed, that cut deep. Not because I need your approval, but because I wanted you to see me, really see me. Tears blurred my vision. I see you now, I said. I wish it hadn't taken me so long. He nodded, his expression softening. Better late than never. And then, to my surprise, he reached across the table and covered my hand with his. His palm was rough, calloused, warm. You're my daughter, he said simply. That's all I ever wanted to be proud of. The tears spilled over then, and I let them. I had spent too many years holding them back. That evening, I stayed for dinner. Mom made roast chicken, the kind that filled the house with a smell both savory and safe. We sat around the table, just the three of us, like old times. But it felt different now, lighter, more honest. Afterward, Dad and I walked out to the porch again. The sky was painted in streaks of pink and gold. He leaned against the railing, looking out at the horizon. You know, he said, I never cared about a degree. Not really. What I cared about was keeping this family together, making sure you had chances I didn't. If I managed that, then I did my job. I stood beside him, watching the sun dip lower. You did more than that, Dad. You gave me everything that matters. He looked at me then, eyes crinkling at the corners. Guess we both had to grow up to understand each other. I smiled through tears. Guess so. And in that moment, the distance between us, the years of silence, the arguments, the shame, collapsed into nothing. There was only love, steady and unshakable, etched into the space between us. After dinner, we lingered on the porch. The night had settled in, warm and steady, with crickets chirping in the tall grass. The neighborhood was quiet, most families tucked inside, their windows glowing faintly. I hadn't sat here like this in years. I used to avoid it, embarrassed by the chipped paint and creaking boards. But now, under the soft hum of summer, it felt like holy ground. Dad leaned back in his chair, the old one that groaned under his weight but never broke. He took a sip of sweet tea, then set the glass down on the railing. Do you remember, he asked, the time the car broke down on the way to your recital? I laughed through my tears. Yeah, I cried the whole ride. You did, he said, grinning. But we made it, didn't we? You pushed the car half a mile, Dad. Worth it, he shrugged. You played like an angel that night. I looked at him, really looked, and realized that was his pattern, pushing, carrying, fixing, doing whatever it took so I could show up to my life. He had been the invisible engine of every opportunity I'd had. Why didn't you ever tell me how hard it was? I asked softly. He thought for a moment, scratching his chin. Because you were a kid. Kids don't need to carry their parents' weight. That's our job. But I wish I'd known, I whispered. Maybe I wouldn't have judged you so harshly. He shook his head gently. No, Em, you were supposed to dream big, to believe the world was wide open. If knowing my struggles would have made you smaller, I'd rather you stayed blind a little longer. His words ached in my chest. All along, he had chosen silence not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. His sacrifices were invisible by design. Later, we walked down the street together. The pavement still held the day's heat, radiating up through the soles of our shoes. He stopped at Mr. Alvarez's house, the same one where he had once fixed the heater for the newborn. The baby's in college now, he said with a chuckle. Makes me feel old. I smiled. I heard about that story. Mom told me once, but I didn't think much of it. Most people don't, he replied. It's just work. Then he glanced at me, his eyes steady. But sometimes work is how you love people. That's something I've learned. We stood there in silence, the porch light flickering above us. I thought about all the times I had reduced him to just a repairman, just a man without a degree. And yet, to this family, he had been a savior. To that recruiter, a role model. To me, though I had been too blind to admit it, he had been the foundation. Back at the house, Mom had pulled out an old photo album. She spread it across the table, pages filled with birthdays, school plays, graduations. In nearly every picture, Dad was there, sometimes in the background, sometimes holding me up, sometimes just smiling from the side. I paused at one photo, me on my 10th birthday, grinning with cake smeared across my face. Dad was beside me, his arm around my shoulder, his shirt stained from work. At the time, I had hated that shirt. I'd begged him to change before the party, but looking at it now, I saw something else. A man who had come straight from a job to make sure he didn't miss his daughter's smile. I touched the photo, my throat tightening. I'm sorry I didn't appreciate this, Dad. He glanced at the page, then at me. That's the thing about pictures. They remind us of what we missed the first time. As the night wound down, I realized something profound. Reconciliation isn't one conversation. It isn't a single apology or a single hug. It's a weaving back together, thread by thread, of all the moments that had frayed. Tonight we were weaving, slowly, carefully, but firmly. Before I left, Dad walked me to the car. The night air was cooler now, a breeze stirring the leaves. I hugged him tightly, longer than I ever had. I don't want to waste any more years being distant, I whispered. He squeezed me back, his voice low in my ear. Then don't. We've got today, that's enough. Tears filled my eyes again, but this time they felt different, not heavy with regret, but light with release. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Dad stood in the driveway, waving, the porch light casting a halo around him. For once, I didn't feel ashamed. I felt anchored. That night, lying in my bed, I replayed everything. The fights, the silence, the shame, and now, the reconciliation. I realized healing doesn't erase the past, it reframes it. The distance we had lived with for so long didn't vanish, but it became a reminder of how much closer we could choose to be now. I thought of the recruiter's words again. He taught me everything. Yes, I thought. He did. And the greatest lesson of all was this. Love can survive misunderstanding. It can outlast pride. It can bridge any distance if you let it. And that night, for the first time in years, I slept deeply, knowing that tomorrow I would wake not just as Emily Carter, the woman chasing degrees and careers, but as Emily Carter, the daughter of Robert Carter, my father, my teacher, my home. For most of my life, I believed a degree was the ultimate passport. It was the document that opened doors, earned respect, silenced doubts. I framed mine, displayed it, let it define me. My father had none, and so I believed he was lacking. That was my logic. Degree equals worth. No degree equals failure. But now, sitting at my desk with a photograph of Dad beside my diploma, I realized how incomplete that equation was. Degrees come in many forms. Some are printed on parchment, embossed with seals, handed over in auditoriums with pomp and applause. Others are written in calloused hands, in promises kept, in sacrifices made quietly in kitchens and garages. One kind hangs on walls, the other is etched in lives. My father held the second kind, and it was worth more than any paper. I began to see degrees everywhere in his life. He had a degree in resilience, earned by working 12-hour days, then coming home to help with homework, never letting exhaustion rob us of his presence. He had a degree in integrity, earned by refusing extra pay when he hadn't solved a problem fully, by returning again and again until it was right. He had a degree in compassion, earned by staying for tea with widows, by fixing units for free when families couldn't afford it, by teaching me that kindness is never wasted. He had a degree in fatherhood, earned not through lectures, but through every ride given, every recital attended, every quiet presence on a porch swing when words failed. These degrees weren't conferred by institutions. They were conferred by life itself, by the people who knew him, by the daughter who finally opened her eyes. After reconciliation, I visited home more often. Each time I noticed new things, small lessons I had missed. The way Dad folded laundry with precision, as if even socks deserved respect. The way he said grace before meals, not with fancy words but with a simple, "Thank you for enough." The way he greeted neighbors by name, never too busy to stop and ask about their children, their parents, their lives. Each act, small as it was another diploma tucked into the library of his character. I realized something else. My own degree, the one framed on my wall, was not diminished by his lack of one. Instead, it was enriched. Because behind every paper degree lies a hidden one, the degree of those who carried us there. Mine was built on his. One evening, I asked him if he ever regretted not going back to school. He thought for a long time, sipping his tea. Then he said, "Sometimes, when I see people talk about things I don't understand, I wonder what it would have been like, but then I look at you, and I think maybe I did okay." Tears filled my eyes. "You did more than okay, Dad." He shrugged, smiling softly. "Then that's enough for me." And I realized he didn't need a degree on the wall. He had one in me. I was his diploma, his legacy, his proof that his life mattered. And isn't that the truest graduation of all? As I share this with you now, I hope you see what I finally did. That success isn't measured only by what you hang on your wall. It's measured by the lives you touch, the promises you keep, the love you give. Some degrees are invisible, but they shine brighter than gold seals and Latin phrases. So if you, like me, have ever felt ashamed of where you came from, look closer. You might find that the very thing you dismissed is the foundation that carries you. And if you have parents, grandparents, people in your life who quietly sacrificed for you, don't wait until it's too late. See them now. Thank them now, because one day you'll realize they taught you everything. In the weeks that followed, I found myself replaying the interview over and over. Not the questions or the answers, but the moment the recruiter said my father's name with reverence. That single moment rewrote my story. For years I had believed my life was about escaping him, outrunning the shadow of no degree. But now I saw the truth. My life was about continuing him, carrying forward what he had already taught, what he had already lived. And so, when people asked me about my background, I stopped hiding. At networking events, when someone said, "Tell me about your family," I didn't edit anymore. I told them about my dad, about Robert Carter, the man who taught me patience, integrity, and resilience. Sometimes they'd nod politely. Sometimes their eyes would soften, and sometimes they'd lean closer, hungry for the reminder that success isn't just about paper, but about character. It became my quiet rebellion, honoring him in spaces where degrees usually rule. One Saturday afternoon, I asked Dad if I could ride along with him on a job. He raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Thought you were done with all this," he teased, patting the passenger seat of his van. "Not done," I said. "Just finally ready to see it." We drove across town to a small house where an older couple lived. Their AC had given out during a brutal heat wave. I followed Dad inside, watching him kneel by the unit, tools spread around him like instruments. He explained each step, not in technical jargon, but in plain words, teaching me as if I were a child again. And I realized this was his classroom. This was his lecture hall. These houses, these families, they were his students, and his lessons stuck far longer than any midterm or final exam. When he finished, the couple thanked him profusely, pressing a few bills into his hand. He hesitated, then tucked them gently back into the husband's pocket. "Save it for your prescriptions," he said. "I'll sleep better knowing you're okay." Walking back to the van, I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Dad," I said, "why do you always give so much of yourself away?" He glanced at me, squinting against the sun. "Because people did it for me once. You don't forget kindness, Em. You pass it on." And in that moment, I understood this was the philosophy of degrees, not accumulation but circulation, not taking but giving. A degree isn't just something you earn, it's something you live. That night, I wrote in my journal, a real degree is conferred every time you choose patience over frustration, honesty over shortcuts, generosity over greed. My father has graduated 1,000 times over, and I am his proof. I closed the journal, tears sliding down my cheeks, but for once they weren't heavy with shame. They were light, filled with gratitude. If you've stayed with me through this story, maybe you've seen pieces of yourself in it. Maybe you've judged someone in your family for not measuring up. Maybe you've carried shame about where you came from. Or maybe you've been the one quietly giving, quietly sacrificing, wondering if anyone noticed. Let me tell you what I learned. People notice. Even if it takes them years, even if it takes a stranger to remind them, the lessons you leave behind are never wasted. My father never walked across a stage to receive a diploma, but every day he walked into people's homes and left behind a degree of trust, of compassion, of love. And those degrees built a life that mattered. So the next time you measure yourself, or your parents, or your children by the yardstick of titles and certificates, remember this. Some of the most important degrees aren't framed on a wall. They are etched in silence, lived in sacrifice, written in love. And that's the philosophy I'll carry forward. Before I end, I want to thank you for listening, for opening your heart to this story. My hope is that you walk away not just entertained, but touched, reminded of your own father, your own mother, your own hidden teachers. I wish you health, peace, and a family that feels like home. May you find pride in the places you once felt shame, and may you honor the people who built your life with hands that never asked for applause. If this story spoke to you, if it made you pause and think of someone you love, I invite you, gently, sincerely, to subscribe. Not because of numbers or algorithms, but because stories like this deserve to keep breathing, to keep finding hearts like yours. Until next time, take care of yourself. Take care of your family. And remember, some of the greatest degrees in life are invisible, but they last forever.